Okay, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Lindsay Blanton. I'm the Water Programs Manager at Wissahickon Trails. And tonight we're going to be talking about water quality in the Wissahickon Creek. So given that it's June and we've all been home for a long time, I'll assume most of you have used Zoom before, but just to run through a few logistical things. The microphones, I believe, are all muted right now. Your video can be on or off. We have found a pattern of some folks having a little bit of a slower connection when their cameras are on. So if you realize that maybe the video is getting laggy or something's freezing, try to turn your camera off and see if that helps. We're going to be using the chat box for questions tonight. You can find the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you kind of hover your mouse at the bottom, chat is right there. You want to make sure that your chat is going to everyone, or you can send a chat directly to me. We're going to be stopping a few times throughout the presentation for questions, but please feel free to write your questions as they come up for you during the presentation. And when we pause for questions, I will scroll back in the chat and answer anything that's come up since the last time we answered questions. Lastly, this is being recorded right now. I'm going to save the chat at the end for any questions we did not get to, and the recording will be made available online on our YouTube account and on our website. So tonight we are going to talk about all things water. This is not intended to be a scientific presentation per se. We're going to talk about what it means for the creek to be healthy or unhealthy. Some of what we've found over many years of monitoring generally, what shape and condition our creek is in. And then lastly, what you can do at home to help protect the creek and improve water quality over time. Just a few words about us, in case anyone is unfamiliar with us. We recently changed our name. We are now Wissahickon Trails, formerly known as Wissahickon Valley Watershed Association. We're an environmental-based nonprofit. We were founded over 60 years ago to protect land and water. So a group of stakeholders realized more and more land in the area was being developed, and that we were seeing more and more severe floods. And so the Wissahickon Valley Watershed Association was formed to protect water quality, preserve land, and engage the public in our environmental mission. We've preserved nearly 1,300 acres of land since 1957 and always working on more. And we have 12 nature preserves, 24 miles of trail. All of the things that we do, we like to engage our community in our work. So if you're interested in monitoring water quality or helping maintenance the trails, helping out with events or anything else we do, or if you'd like to support the organization, you can visit our new website, wissahickontrails.org. And there's a map over here of the watershed and all of our preserved land in the Green Ribbon Trail. So I want this to be interactive. Please feel free to use the chat box. And I just wanted to stop to begin the presentation to ask, why does clean water matter to you? Why have you tuned into this presentation tonight? Is there something specific you wanted to learn, or some particular way, water intersects with your life or your day-to-day in the watershed? So if you can take a minute here to type into the chat box so I can get a sense of what we're all interested in for tonight. Okay, we can come back to this. Okay, now they're putting in, someone lives in the Pequessing watershed. Yes, awesome. Talk about some of our neighboring watersheds. All right, so I will come back to these throughout the presentation. I'll move them up. How can you tell if they're healthy? Okay. So we will get to that. And again, as I said, as we move through the presentation, if you have something occur to you or you have a pressing question, just type it in the chat box and we'll pause a few times to answer questions. So we had conducted a survey a few years ago, just asking, what does the Wissahickon Creek mean to you? And we got lots of answers, but they kind of centered around a few themes. You see a lot about recreation, people are hiking, birding, dog walking, and then there are a lot of pieces about just health and wellness, enjoying the peacefulness of the trails and that piece of recreation. There's a little bit about drinking water. So there are lots of ways that the Wissahickon Creek intersects with our lives, literally and figuratively. It runs through our community. We're all using the trails and engaging. And so a few things that we kind of hear about when people come to us and they want to know more about water quality, or they have a water quality concern that they bring to the township or to us, centers around a couple things. Recreation is a huge way that we interact with the Wissahickon Creek. People are out on the trails all the time. People are, the Wissahickon is a trout stocked stream. So there are a few areas that are designated for fishing. People are playing in the creek down in, Devil's Pool. So recreation is a big thing in this watershed. People also really care about wildlife, whether it's migratory birds or, again, fish, or, salamanders that you're catching with your kids. The healthy habitat of the Wissahickon comes up as something that people want to know more about. And lastly, drinking water is brought up, and the Wissahickon Creek runs into the Schuylkill River, which is used as drinking water in the city of Philadelphia. The Schuylkill intake facility serves about 1/3 of the city of Philadelphia with drinking water. But our drinking water here in the watershed is more from groundwater. So there are a number of wells in the watershed, but also sourced from the Delaware River. So we're not necessarily drinking the Wissahickon Creek water in our watershed, but it does go into the Schuylkill and is a source of drinking water in Philadelphia. So just want to touch on what a watershed is. It was in our name for 60 years, but not everyone knows what a watershed is. It's not always covered in school. This is kind of a silly illustration from a kid's book, but I like it because it shows, kind of that topographical, geographical sense of the watershed. So essentially a watershed is just an area of land where when it rains, all of the water pours into one common water body. So everywhere is a watershed. Anywhere you've ever lived is a watershed. And they are nesting also. So you can zoom in and out on a watershed scale. If I live in Upper Dublin, I may live in the Pine Run watershed. It's a small tributary. And as you zoom out, the Pine Run is part of the Sandy Run watershed, which is part of the Wissahickon watershed, part of the Schuylkill watershed, the Delaware, and so on out to the ocean. So there are large and small watersheds. And interestingly, a lot of, road names are even kind of named for these geographical boundaries. There's Ridge Avenue. It's literally, a ridge dividing the Wissahickon from the Schuylkill watershed. We also have Edge Hill Road in Abington that kind of divides the Wissahickon from the Pennypack. So we can think of it just as a geographical area where the water is kind of pouring into one water body. So we're talking a lot about clean water, healthy water. What does that mean? Those are, general vague terms. Again, we're not going to have a super scientific presentation, but we are going to delve into what are the different things we're looking at when we're talking about a healthy creek, and what we've monitored over time. So what does a healthy watershed look like? We can pretty easily, quickly tell when we look at these two photos which watershed looks healthy, which creek looks healthy, and which does not. There are features that jump right out to you, whether it's the channel being shaded, whether it's, you know, what the bottom of the creek bed looks like. Is it concrete or is it lots of rocks that the water is pouring over? So this is an obvious one. Here are two pictures from the Wissahickon, two different points on the main stem of the Wissahickon, and then it becomes not so clear. Which section is healthier? What makes it healthier? What are we looking for when we decide if the creek is healthy or not healthy? So this is kind of what we're going to delve into tonight, talking a little bit about how we designate these things. If anyone has an idea of which creek section here is healthier from our habitat monitoring, feel free to write in the chat box right or left, and I can tell you later which one was healthier when we get to questions. So there are many parameters that, you know, we look at when we're talking about creek health. Their entire, you know, like sciences and studies of, you know, ecology and limnology, all these freshwater systems and habitats, hydrology. But generally, just from kind of a layman's standpoint, we're going to talk about a few things tonight that you can learn to understand and kind of observe even when you're walking along the trail. We'll talk about these things and you'll come to kind of see as you move through the watershed, noticing more, oh, this section's very eroded, this section has no shade, things like that. So erosion is very visible. We see it throughout the watershed, and essentially it just means that the bank has been kind of taken off. It's unstable, there's raw earth kind of happening, and this happens when there's a large storm, there's really fast water moving through the channel. Water is a powerful erosive agent, so it's kind of taking pieces of the bank with it over time and moving that dirt and sediment downstream. So on the left, we have a section of bank that is not eroded. This is actually down by Valley Green Inn. The bank is rocky, so it's not going to get very eroded. The other section is by Lafayette Avenue, I believe. And this is a section where the water gets really ripping, and there are huge kind of incised banks. We call this channelized, when instead of a general, you know, slope of a U shape in the bank gets cut more and more, and you see a straight up and down bank. So the water just can only move in that channel. It's not gently connected to its floodplain, and this is a channelized stream. Here's a diagram of what happens. So the fastest current, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we see this a lot in the creek where around a bend especially, the water moves very quickly and starts to scoop the bank out like this. We have a lot of fallen trees that happen on these banks where it starts to get scooped out, it's eroded, it's undercutting the roots of the trees that are on the banks, and then they just topple in over time. So this is kind of a double whammy. You know, we lose the tree that was anchoring the bank and some of that vegetative protection on the bank, and it continues to fall in. So kind of a coupled idea with the erosion is sedimentation. So the sediment from the banks, or even just from overland flow. So sediment that's just being washed into the creek when it rains, eventually fills in, you know, the particulates kind of fill in the bottom of the stream bed. So again, on the left here, we have a picture of, you know, a healthier stream bottom where it's not choked in with sediment. You could lift any one of these rocks, and this means that there's lots of habitat. There are lots of nooks and crannies for bugs, fish, like if you imagine you were a small critter and you look at the stream bed and you think, where could I hide? Where could I go? This is a healthier stream bottom. This, again, I guess I'm picking on this section by Lafayette Avenue. This is a section where the stream bottom it looks flat. It almost looks like a filled in concrete, because all of that fine little particulate has filled in all of the nooks and crannies of the stones on the bottom of the creek. Not a lot of habitat there. Another thing we think about with sedimentation is actually, instead of being, filled in under the water, these little sediment islands or point bars in the creek. And this happens a lot when the creek twists and turns. The water slows down in a certain area and drops out that sediment. And so over time, it keeps dropping sediment there every storm, and we get these little islands. So this is another sign of lots of sedimentation dropping out. Here's a picture to kind of illustrate that. Over here, all the way to the right, with the stone mostly filled in, this is what we don't want. And over towards the left, with the cobbles more out, you could pick up any one of those rocks in the creek. That's what we want. In-stream habitat. Again, so yeah, these pictures are all double whammies. We've got a lot of erosion here. And a flat stream bed with sedimentation. But when we look at the picture on the left, we see snags in the creek. We see lots of rocky boulders, little, again, nooks and crannies for creatures to hide. There's lots of habitat. There's lots of kind of like diverse places to go within the stream. Whereas on the right, and in a lot of sections in the Wissahickon, we'll see kind of a flat stream bed, not a lot of nooks and crannies. We won't see a lot of diverse, places to go. It's like a flat stream, not a lot of like water and rocks and diversity in that stream channel. Dissolved oxygen and temperature are important for creek health. So dissolved oxygen, basically, depending on the water's temperature, if it's really, really hot, it can't hold as much oxygen in it. You think about the molecules moving very quickly. The water doesn't hold as much, gas in it. The colder the water is, the more dissolved oxygen it can hold. And so we have an issue with shade and temperature and dissolved oxygen in the creek. So if a creek is very shaded, it's not heating up really fast in the summertime, it's not just baking. In the summer, it will be cooler and it will hold more oxygen. Whereas this photo is not Lafayette Avenue. This is in Ambler, just above that rotary bridge. Here's the Ambler piles. So again, this section has no shade because of the width of the stream. That's another thing that happens over time with lots of erosion and trees falling in, is the creek will widen and widen as we lose those trees on the banks. And then you have less canopy. The creek is wide, it's shallow, and it warms up really quickly in the summertime. So when it's shallow and it's hot, it can't hold as much oxygen, and the bugs and fish and salamanders that are living in the creek that need oxygen in the creek have a hard time in the summertime. So here's a graph, the relationship of temperature to dissolved oxygen. The hotter we go, the less oxygen the water holds. And lastly, riparian buffers. Riparian buffer is basically just the width on either side of the stream bank, where there's not any man-made encroachment into that stream channel section. So on the left, we have a really, really wide riparian buffer. This is on the Green Ribbon Trail. It's been preserved over time, and we have a really wide section that buffers the creek from the rest of suburbia. On the right, we have this is a golf course, mows right up to the edge. There's nothing protecting the creek from, runoff, from fertilizer, from anything that's coming into the creek. It's just unprotected. And here's an image or a diagram of buffer. So we think about the buffer being a good place for floodwaters to spread out when we have a really large storm. If we have development that's right in on the edge of the creek, those structures may be affected in the flood. If we leave a wide buffer in a naturalized condition, when that water spreads out, wants to spread out into its floodplain, trees and naturalized conditions. Okay, any questions about these different things we think about when we talk about creek health? Or are there any other ones that you want to know about or discuss? Let me zoom back a little bit in the chat.
Hi there.
Yes, hi.
Hello, hello. Hi there. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much. I was just wondering about the collaborative partnerships you might have with some of these folks that are, like the golf course, etc. How much are they interested in their own stewardship of the waterways?
That's a great question. So we try to work a lot with all the different stakeholders of the watershed, whether it's, private landowner, the homeowners, universities or institutions, golf courses, faith-based organizations. The golf courses are unique because, one, there are so many of them in our watershed. They're like an unreasonable amount of golf courses, in my opinion. But also, they own a lot of land. And the way they manage the land certainly is very different from a naturalized condition. So they have a lot of things that they could do that could, inch us forward and help with all of this open space in the watershed, kind of absorbing water and helping floodplains and such. The one that I pictured, there are some golf courses that are right on the creek. And so they are good partners with us to kind of talk about water quality, talk about how close to the creek they're fertilizing. In the past, I believe some would go right up to the creek and you would see little fertilizer pellets going right into the creek. So we've worked with them over time, and some have even, especially ones that are on the creek, naturally, when there's a flood, their golf courses are very affected. There's not a lot of erosion control. They can have to pay, thousands of dollars repairing their turf. So over time, they've kind of realized that it's in their best interest as well to kind of incorporate maybe some more natural practices, having more of that riparian buffer or meadows and native plants along the stream to help with some of that actually saves them money over time, not having to repair after floods. So some of them have been great partners and have been really interested in water quality as well. So we just try to use them as our shining superstars and reach more and more golf courses.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Is it just me, the size of the presentation slide changing? I am not sure. I have my presentation in full screen, so hopefully there aren't any kind of tech issues, but do let me know if things are getting wonky with the slides. And back to that question of which of those sections of the Wissahickon Creek at the beginning was healthier. So we go out once a year, every single year, to do what are called habitat assessments. We use a lot of the parameters that I just went through in the last couple of slides of, erosion and sedimentation and kind of riparian buffer and all of these things. And they actually get numerical scores so that we can track over time. So it's, less narrative, less qualitative, and more that we can track health changes over time. It actually was the right side picture that was healthier. So I know 2 of you said the right and you were correct. Well done. Okay, so we will move on. So now we'll talk a little bit about what we have found in the Wissahickon, what these big stressors are, and not so much, again, about, you know, scientific graphs and analyses we've done. If you're interested in that, please follow up with me afterwards and we can, you know, delve into any nitty-gritty questions. So we have been monitoring the Wissahickon and its tributaries for many, many years. We have a project called Stream Map, or Stream Monitoring and Assessment Program. That's been going since 2003. But we also have lots of data all the way back to 1957 when we were founded, of a little bit more intermittent data collection, but still lots of data collection over the decades. As part of Stream Map, again, which was founded in 2003, we conduct regular year-round sampling. So we do chemical sampling 4 times a year. That basically just means we grab, you know, a sample of creek water and we send it to a lab and we have it analyzed for certain things. Does it have a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus, or how much suspended sediment is in the water, these kinds of things. We do that once a season. We collect biological data. So we do have partners in the area who are collecting other things. Our partner at the Academy of Natural Science collects algae and fish data, which is wonderful. And we as staff at Wissahickon Trails collect macroinvertebrate data, which we're going to talk a little bit more about macroinvertebrates in a few slides, but those are the bugs that live in the creek. We essentially go to certain sites every year, collect the bugs, and basically from what's there, we can kind of assess how healthy the creek is. And lastly, we collect habitat data that I just spoke a little bit about, where we're looking at different health parameters and assigning a site almost a grade. There are, you know, numbers that fall within poor category or marginal. So we kind of go up the scale and see how each site is doing every year. So here's another map of the watershed that is showing the land use. So everything you see in a red or a pink is kind of all the places that the watershed has been developed in some way. So you see it's mostly red and pink. And there are patches of area that has been preserved. You'll notice a large green area down in Philadelphia. That's the park that was preserved back in the 1800s. And then sections throughout the watershed, little patches of open space that are, you know, still forested and have some kind of cover. So from this, we can kind of expect that the creek in those more developed areas not be as healthy. So all of the little sections here that are red, these are the tributaries and sections of the main stem of the Wissahickon Creek that are what we call impaired or not attaining aquatic life use. Essentially, the EPA and DEP have lots of ways they kind of come out and assess if a water body is healthy, and if it's not, or if it's impaired. There are certain laws and regulations that, that have to be followed to improve the health of the creek over time. So because the Wissahickon Creek is mostly red, we do have EPA and DEP kind of regulations that all the townships follow, not the wastewater treatment plants, to improve the health of the creek. So what happens when we have these more developed areas that we saw in red and pink is that we have stormwater runoff. We use this word a lot. It kind of sounds like a jargony word, and I wish we had some kind of substitute, but stormwater runoff seems to convey it best. Essentially what that means is, in a naturalized condition like you see on the left, we would have, you know, trees and meadows, and when the rain fell on that land, it wouldn't all be running off. It'd be hitting, you know, the vegetation, soaking into the ground, etc. But as we add more parking lots, driveways, buildings, roads, this is what's called an impervious surface. So the water can't permeate through to the ground anymore. It just hits that blacktop and it has nowhere to go. so it will run off. So our watershed, I don't have a super current number, but within the last 5 years, it was around 30% impervious. So the example of this urban environment, the numbers that are here, we're not quite there. We're not, you know, a developed city, but we do have a lot of impervious cover as, you know, an older suburban area. And so what happens is, again, in this natural condition on the left, we would have water falling when it rains and running into the ground, very little running off. But in an urban environment, we drastically increase the amount of water that's all running off at once. So instead of, you know, 50% of the water that falls going into the ground, we have 15, and we have a huge amount running off to the creek. It's kind of gross, but I like to call this the toilet flush effect because it conveys that idea of like when it rains, all of the water is just running into the creeks at once. It's like a big, you know, a big volume event where it may not have been a particularly large rain event. The amount of volume that comes to the creek as we develop more and more feels like a really large rain event to the creek. So urban runoff, suburban runoff is a huge source of pollution and stress to the creek. I would say that that's true of most suburban creeks, especially in the greater Philadelphia area. Pennypack, you know, the Tookoonee, Perkiomen less so, it's less developed, but the Schuylkill, you know, all of these watersheds have a lot of development, a lot of pavement, and so all of this runoff is a big stressor. It's a stressor in two ways, one in quality and one in quantity. I already talked a little bit about the quantity. That's that high volume event coming every time it rains. The quality is that instead of water soaking into the ground and kind of filtering anything that would be in the water, any pollutants or particulates, when it runs off over, you know, imagine a parking lot, and it goes into those storm drains right to the creek, anything that was on the parking lot, anything that was on, you know, a driveway or lawn or golf course, etc., that's running right off into the creek. So the creek receives a lot more pollutants in this kind of environment. So I also didn't mention construction sites. Construction sites can be a large source of pollutants. All of the sediment is coming off of those in a storm event, which is kind of what's pictured here on the left. So yeah, these storm drains, whatever goes into them is going right to the creek. They do not go to any kind of water processing facility. They're not getting treated. Those go to the creek itself. So fertilizers, you know, any lawn chemicals, litter, road salt, the little rainbow puddles that you see in parking lots or driveways, that's like motor oil that's leaked. All of that goes to the creek. So we have to be really careful what comes into these storm drains and think more about how to kind of intercept those pollutants from the creek. So the second issue is quantity, which we talked about. The photo on the left here is an old photo. I don't know what year it's from, but this is like the, you know, Fort Washington Business Park area, completely flooded. And the one on the right here is a much more recent photo of Morris Road, impassable. There are lots of rain events where we get, you know, topped over, especially towards the bottom of the watershed. What road is it? That bridge that's always out down by like Germantown or Washington Park. But yeah, floods are a common occurrence here. And it is because of that amount of runoff that's coming. If it rains really hard, a lot of rain at one time, that causes our flooding events. For those of you who have been to our office, to the barn, this is a photo of the back of the parking lot. So just along the tree line here is the Wissahickon. You can't even see it in this photo. It is happily meandering in its bed. But in 2014, so not long ago, this is what the parking lot looked like. So totally, totally full. And if you know the area, you know that on the other side of the creek there, it's our 4 Mills Nature Reserve. We've got, you know, lots of area, lots of floodplain for the water to spread out, and it's fully topped the bank and come over into our parking lot. So yes, this happens, and this is April, so it wasn't even hurricane season. Don't quite remember what storm came through, but yeah, if you've lived in the watershed a while, you know we have floods. So those floods kind of tie to a lot of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of you know, health metrics and indicators, thus leading to big erosion, sedimentation, kind of habitat destruction. It can, you know, widen the creek over time and make less shade and hotter temperatures. So a lot of these suburban, you know, stormwater runoff issues tie directly to how we could make the creek more healthy over time. So we're going to talk a little bit about macroinvertebrates, or bugs that are in the stream. We like to call them the canaries in the coal mine because essentially they, instead of taking kind of a sample of water, that's kind of like taking a photograph. It's a snapshot in time. It's just the water that was running through the creek at that particular moment. It could have totally missed a moment where, you know, 5 minutes later, there was a big pollution event and some, you know, fertilizer came through the stream. We would miss that in our water quality sample. But when we look at biological things like the bugs or the algae or the fish, these are things that live in the creek a long time. There are bugs in every system, so we can look at them in any, you know, creek or tributary. And the reason they tell us a lot is because they have varying levels of pollution tolerance. So if we find certain things in the creek, we know, oh, okay, that one needs a lot of dissolved oxygen. If it's here, this creek section must be pretty okay for most of the year. If we don't find those critters and we find a bunch of stuff that could live in a ditch, we know, ooh, lots of things are missing. That's not a good indicator. So, you know, the chemical water samples are great, habitat samples are great, but looking at the biology in the creek really can tell us a lot. The other thing, unlike, you know, fish, is that the bugs, it says relatively sedentary. I guess I would say they live in the same place a long time. I don't know that they're sedentary per se, but they're in the same sections of creek. So we'll know over time, you know, some of them live 1 to 2 years in the creek before they're hatching out into their, you know, adult stages. We learn a lot from what bugs are there. And if anyone hates bugs, I have a warning that you're about to see videos of bugs. But you kind of grow to love them. So this is kind of a grouping of how you know by what you find whether the stream is, you know, in really good shape, because you're finding things that are very intolerant to pollution. If there were pollution there, they wouldn't survive, versus, you know, this middle range where it's okay. They're not, you know, really, really healthy, you know, like Poconos Woods, but there are some things there that require okay water quality conditions. And then there are ones on the bottom tier that could live, like I said, in a ditch. They have low oxygen requirements. They're very tolerant to all kinds of adverse conditions. I will say that there are tons and tons of species of each of these kind of critters. So when you get down into actually collecting the bugs and analyzing them, you get lots of nuance that tells you, you know, based on just this species, you know, this species of Caddis Fly is really, really pollution intolerant, or, you know, this whatever snail. So you really have to dive deep into it and see what exact species you have. But I'm going to show you, I went last week to Ambler, which was delightful because I've been home for 4 months, and I got in the creek with a net and I found some bugs. So I have a video of what we've got in the Wissahickon here. Hopefully it starts. Okay. So hopefully the video doesn't lag. Just for scale, that was the size of the pan and the net that I was using. These are pretty small bugs, but you can see them with your eye. And this is just taken on my phone. So this big one in the center here, we have a damselfly. And when you kind of adjust your eyes, you can see all kinds of life in this water. It's teeming with movement. This is a scud. This is kind of in the middle of that pollution tolerance, kind of shrimp-like, really fast, it swims sideways. And all the different bugs have different spots in the food chain, right? Some of them eat other bugs. Some of them are kind of grazing on, little plant matter, or, filter feeding. You might hear a train. I live near a train station. This is a midge. So this is more pollution tolerant, and it has a really characteristic way of moving. It does this little midge dance. Here again is a damselfly. These 3 tail filaments on the back of the bug are actually its gills. That's how it's receiving oxygen from the creek. The damselflies are really, really cute. These were really big in June, so they're very visible. This is an orb snail. It's pretty tiny. And then next we will have a lunged snail. So if you're finding snails in the creek, some of them mean that there's not a lot of pollution. Sorry, I'll go back. And some of them mean that, what did I say? Some of them mean that there's little pollution, and some of them are very tolerant, and so there could be lots of pollution. And the way you would tell is you hold the snail with the little tip pointing up, and you look at the opening. So if the opening of the little snail is to the left, left is for lunged. Lunged snails can survive in much more polluted waters or lower oxygen. If you're holding the snail with the little tip up and the opening is to the right, it is a gilled snail, and they need much cleaner, healthier conditions. So if you're ever looking at snails in the creek, left is lunged, right is gilled. This is opening to the left, so this is a lunged snail. And I've got footage of him crawling along. So yeah, essentially just went into the creek with a net and scooped around the rocks, and there's tons of life in the water that we don't see because it's pretty tiny. This is a caddis fly. You see the little fuzzy area on its abdomen? Those are its gills. And the little thing that protrudes from the butt end of it, that's how it kind of attaches to rocks, and it catches food that's straining through the water. These guys are everywhere in the Wissahickon, and they are kind of medium pollution tolerant. I think they look like the very hungry caterpillar. They can be really green. This one is a black fly larva. So, the black flies that we see, a housefly, this is what it starts out as. So they are very pollution tolerant. They can survive in anything. It looks like a little bowling pin with a sticky butt. This is a flatworm. Hold on, I think it'll. They're a really old organism, and it literally just looks like a small ribbon. It has 2 little dots that are like light sensing organs. It doesn't even really have eyes. There were mayflies in the video, but they were so tiny they couldn't be seen. So that last one that I had there was a mayfly, and this is a water penny. So I'm gonna go back just so we can see what we had here. So we don't have any stoneflies in the Wissahickon. They are pretty pollution sensitive. We don't have them. We do have this orb snail. We found this. Again, I mentioned the snails that open to the right. Those are the gilled snail. We didn't find one of those. But we did have mayflies. We do have mayflies in the Wissahickon. And again, there are lots of different species that kind of get more nuanced on exactly how pollution tolerant or intolerant it is. So we do have those. We had black fly larva, scud, the filtering caddis fly. We have crayfish. We have crane flies, but we didn't see them in the video, and we have dragonflies. And you know some of these just from being on the trail and actually seeing dragonflies or seeing mayflies. So when we see them in their, adult stage, we know that they were in the water and they hatched out and that water was healthy enough for them. On the very bottom, we have midges. That was that one that was dancing really fast. And I'll share this presentation at the end too, so you can see them again. But there are lots of midges throughout the watershed. And we had this pouch snail, or the one that opens to the left. Not on here are leeches. There are also leeches. So just finding the critters that are at the bottom here that indicate poor water quality doesn't automatically mean that the water quality is poor. It just means that there's diversity and that these guys can live here too. The further up the ladder you go, the more of these more pollution intolerant species you're finding, the better the water. And the more diverse, the better also. We also are measuring, how many different species we're having, as opposed to maybe having only caddis flies in a particular section, which sometimes when we sample, it seems like we're only getting one thing. And caddis flies are everywhere. Skip through. So I'll go through just a summary of takeaways that we have from doing all the monitoring that we do in the creek over the years. We know from our chemistry sampling that the nutrient concentrations in the Wissahickon are high. So nutrients just means nitrogen and phosphorus. You can think of that as plant food, like fertilizer, but it's also naturally occurring. So it's not just coming from fertilizer. But when there's a lot of nutrients in the water, this is when we see really big algal blooms. So algae is natural. It's in like any waterway. It's not in itself a problem. It's when there's lots and lots of algae, because there's lots and lots of nutrients in the water, that we can have issues. So the algae itself creates lots of oxygen, but it also takes oxygen out of the water. And so you can have these big swings of dissolved oxygen. And in the summertime, if there's tons and tons of algae, you can have big oxygen dips. It can tank. And that can cause, fish kills if there's just a sudden drop in oxygen in the water. So that is a cause for concern that we keep our eye on, is, how much nitrogen and phosphorus are in the water. We also talked a lot about the, suburbanization, land development, stormwater runoff causing big issues with erosion, sedimentation, habitat loss. These are ongoing stressors that we monitor in the Wissahickon. We definitely have a ways to go with all of that. Temperature and dissolved oxygen can be problematic. So because we're a trout stock stream, there are state designations for how hot the water can get for the fish. So we monitor throughout the year. We actually are working with Temple to do more temperature monitoring with little 15-minute loggers that take temperature readings to see, are we exceeding those state guidelines of how hot our water can get. It can be a big issue with summer storms. You imagine how hot the blacktops are, and the water will come streaming off of those, and it's like a heat shock to the system. That can be really bad for the fish and bugs. But lastly, a positive note, we have found in our monitoring and especially in our habitat assessments that our sections of creek that are around land that's been preserved, especially along the Green Ribbon Trail where we have wide buffers, these sections are doing better. There's a very positive impact and correlation between having preserved land near the creek and the health of the creek. You might remember, and I can go back if there are questions, but the map that I showed of the Wissahickon Creek with all the different tributaries and main stem sections that were red, there was a very tiny section that was actually green, and that was through Whitpain. That was Prophecy Creek. And the reason that's green is because there's way less development there. There's lots of open space. There's Wings Field and Briar Hill and different parks where just a lot of section along Prophecy is preserved. And that means that the water quality there is significantly better, makes a big difference. So it's a positive thing that we found, you know, the work of preserving land over time does affect water quality. So want to keep doing the good things. Any questions? So I am going to go back a bit, see what questions we got from last time. A snail that opens to the right is an indicator of good health, and the snail that opens to the left is an indicator of poor health. Correct. Yes. So yeah, they're just totally different species. And this is true for the different caddis flies too. It's like the filter feeding caddis fly is a little more pollution tolerant. And then there's another species of caddis fly altogether that needs very clean water and is, you know, a totally different indicator, but they're both caddis flies. So, you know, people get really, really deep into the entomology side of this and can ID the insects, you know, down to species and give us really detailed analyses of what's in our creek and what that means about the health. We kind of get a report back, which is fun. Are there more healthy regions of the water than others? Meaning you can't take one sample as an overall picture of health. Absolutely, absolutely. So like I just talked about Prophecy Creek, there are sections of the watershed, really each site to site, you know, is a different, gets different health, you know, ratings. From the water chemistry, what's directly around that site, is there a wastewater treatment plant above it, is there a golf course, is there a neighborhood, to what bugs are there, is it really shaded and, you know, the water is cool, or is it not shaded and the water is hot, you know, each site to site, as these parameters change, it can be very, very different. So yeah, we try to look at overall trends. So we know, you know, some tributaries as a trend, because they're not on the main stem and there's no Green Ribbon Trail, we haven't preserved as much land there. Some tributaries are not in great shape, like the Sandy Run is not a super healthy tributary. It's very developed through Abington and Upper Dublin. So yeah, we kind of take patterns and trends and average what we can find out. How has the health of the creek changed recently? Is it improving or getting worse? That is a very good question. So over the course of 5 years, we could make a really preliminary statement about health, or getting worse, getting better. It's great to have a data set that's really large and long, where we can compare back through, you know, several decades. So we know, was this a blip? Was there a really bad storm this year? You know, some adverse event where we're seeing this, it's not really a trend, it's just, you know, an outlier. But I would say, and we talk about this a lot with our partners at, you know, the Academy of Natural Science and Temple and Stroud, that just the mark of our water quality not degrading, the scores not going down, that's actually a win. because we have new development all the time. So if we're increasing impervious surface, but our water quality is staying the same, in a way, you know, we would see, you know, more development and water quality decline, but we're keeping it flat. So that means that some of the things that we're doing are protective. You know, stormwater management practices that townships are doing, preserving open space and buffering the creek from those new developments, that helps us kind of keep an even keel, keep the creek not from getting worse. So I would say it's not improving per se, but it is holding steady. And in a watershed where we're always having more suburban sprawl, that is a good thing. If you could magically change one thing to help improve water quality of the creek, what issue would you most like to see addressed? Ooh. I think if every municipality, I mean, they already are and they're required to, but if we saw more and more adoption of green infrastructure, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and kind of buffering the creek from these new developments, if every new development had, you know, managed the new runoff it was creating, I think we would see big strides in the creek. Because of this, you know, runoff issue with the pollutants it creates and the volume and flooding it creates, if we could just work on managing that runoff that's coming off of our, you know, developed land, I think it would make a really big difference in the creek. And we are working on that. And the townships, you know, have to by law. So that's a nice thing. Applying this current situation with COVID and how nature has been impacted in a general positive way, like hearing more birdsong or less waste, has there been an impact on waterways that you're aware of? I am so upset that I didn't get to this article today because I might have had an answer, but maybe I'll send out an answer later after I read it. There was an article put out by the Academy of Natural Science that goes over just that. You know, are we seeing an impact on our waterways because of this pandemic? Either because people are driving less, or, you know, people are even just using natural spaces more. What are we finding? So shucks, I didn't read it yet. I don't know, but I will follow up on that one. And lastly, you mentioned Sandy Run. Are there efforts to establish a riparian buffer with trail along Sandy Run? I very much wish that there were a beautiful big trail all along Sandy Run. Through a lot of our work with the William Penn Foundation, we try to focus in on an area, especially in headwaters, where we can concentrate our efforts, we can do lots of outreach, we can do projects, and so we can actually measure a change in water quality as, you know, a delta from everything that we've done. And in Sandy Run, we've started, because it's, you know, there are tons of homes throughout Abington. It's very residential. And so when thinking about how can we impact water quality, we had to say, we need to do something with homeowners. We need to go to people's homes. And so something that we're doing there is to increase stormwater management on homes, on lawns. And so we're hoping over time this is going to improve the Sandy Run as we start at the headwaters and move down. But in terms of, so the Sandy Run runs through Abington and Upper Dublin. Both townships are very cognizant of water quality issues, especially since the Sandy Run floods a lot. So it is kind of a health and safety issue for these townships. They're very aware. They try to do big projects to manage stormwater. So they do projects. I don't know that there are trail plans, but I think that is a wonderful dream big idea, and I will pass it up the chain to have a riparian buffer and trail along the Sandy Run, because that would be awesome. Okay, So we are going to move on to the next section, which is what can you do at home, which is the best part really, because no one wants to feel helpless in the face of bad news. So I will give you the good news in that we can all do something. How can you protect water quality? So I've mentioned a couple times already green infrastructure. This again is a jargony buzzword that we use a lot, but basically it just means this. I love this picture because it makes it all so simple. So the urban or suburban sprawl picture would be this gray funnel on the right of just the water runs off all of our paved surfaces. It goes right to the waterways. It brings all the pollution and volume straight to the creek. That's the funnel. What we want to do is to emulate a more natural condition before all the suburban sprawl, which is to recreate, what if this were forested? What if this was a meadow? How can we filter the water and slow it down, kind of capture? So of course we can't remove all the homes and we can't remove the mall and 309, but how can we be creative about adding things back in that mimic this? That's what we call green infrastructure. So I mentioned a little bit about working with homeowners. We all live in the watershed, and so there are lots of things that you can start just at home that if everyone did, it would make a big difference. So typically, it's raining, it's running off your roof. Lots of gutters or lots of homes were built such that the gutters actually go right underground and bring your, runoff from your property right to the street. That is a condition that we would want to intercept. So we want to prevent the rain from going into the drain. We want to keep it on your property. And so instead of just having, flooding waters running into your lawn, there are lots of green infrastructure tools that you can use at home to capture the water, have it soak into the ground and slow down. So that's how we mimic nature. One of those is a rain barrel. So that's usually like 55 or 60 gallons of water that you're capturing at your gutter that you then save and use for later. You can, wash your car, water garden beds. You're basically just preventing that water from going right to the creek during the rain, and you're just using it later after the storm. So it'll just trickle more slowly off of your property or into the ground, which is great. Another green infrastructure tool would be a rain garden. That essentially is just a mini bowl-shaped garden. It doesn't have to be big. It can actually be pretty small, but it's ideal to have water kind of directed to it, and then that water kind of soaks into the ground in this bowl. You use native plants with really deep roots that like to have a lot of water, and in this way you can manage a really large amount of water coming off your roof, more than with a rain barrel, and just kind of soak it up so it's not running off of your property. There are other things as well that you can do. You can even just redirecting your gutters. So over here on the top column on the right, if your gutter currently goes onto your driveway and would just run down your driveway, simplest thing you can do is just divert the gutter and have it go onto your lawn or into a garden bed. Building rain gardens, rain barrels, planting more trees, and especially if you live along any stream, planting your own riparian buffer and not mowing right up to the edge of the lawn would be really helpful to the creek. It also helps protect your property from erosion. Rethinking landscaping practices. Lots of people have lots of lawn, and not everyone is really using their lawn for, like recreation or play. Thinking about changing some of your lawn into more garden or even a meadowed area, lots of native plants. Native plants soak up so much more water than lawn or turf grass. And so that is a really beneficial practice. And also has a lot of habitat benefits. So anytime you're using lots of native plants are essentially just plants that are native to this area. They're adapted to this area. So they may need less watering through the summer because they're adapted to the amount of rainfall that we get. And they're also beneficial for our local flora. So, insects and butterflies and birds, they're all used to, and they've adapted with the plants that should be here. And so when they're migrating through and they're looking, butterflies are looking for milkweed, or, bees are looking for a particular flower to pollinate. The more we have native plants here, the more your yard becomes, a wildlife mecca. So that's nice as well to use native plants. We can provide resources, or there might already be links on our website for where you can find native plants, and also some instructions about rain gardens and rain barrels if you want to learn more. Salt has come up recently more and more as people realize, one, how much we all use and how much our townships use on our roadways, and how increasingly it gets into the groundwater. It can leach out of the soil for many, many months after the wintertime and make our freshwater salty. So of course the fish that are in our streams are looking for fresh water. If we have spikes of salty water, it's actually really detrimental to them and can be toxic. So want to think about how we can minimize salt use in the wintertime. We don't think people shouldn't use salt. It's definitely a safety measure that, no one wants to slip and fall. But there are lots of things that you can do to kind of lessen your salt use. So one is to shovel before you salt. You don't want to just throw salt on all the snow and think that will melt it all. You would have to use a lot of salt. So you want to shovel early and often, and you'll have less, icing and need less salt. Also, we're encouraging people to reuse the salt. If I had everyone's camera on, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've seen a giant pile of salt well after a snowstorm, like in the road or in the parking lots. They're just piles of salt, but there's no more snow or ice. So one thing we're encouraging people to do is if you, salted your sidewalk or your driveway and the storm is over and the ice is gone, hey, you could sweep it back up and reuse it again. That just means that there's less salt sitting around for when it rains and gets washed into the creek, or, it's leaching into the soil. The salt that goes into the soil, maybe near your driveway, is also bad for your plants and your lawn. You don't want to use any products that contain urea. You don't want to use kitty litter or ashes. There are all kinds of alternative suggestions that people have. So just, you can use normal salt. They make salt that's, better for your pets, pet paws and things. They're all different kinds of salt. But just try not to use anything that, like kitty litter or urea or ashes, all these other examples. We also don't want that in the creek for other reasons. And educate your neighbors. So if you're out there using less salt, if you're out there sweeping up your salt, talk to your neighbor, encourage them to do the same, and we can have less salty waters. It was not an issue this winter because it never snowed, but next year. Lawn chemicals. So again, if we're minimizing the amount of water that actually runs off your property, that's great. But this is addressing all of the things that if water were running off of your property, let's think about what chemicals are in the water and what pollutants are coming to the creek. So, use of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. You never want to use those if rain is in the forecast and it's just going to wash off of your property. Always best to do, if you are using those, use those, on clear, no precipitation days. But there are all kinds of natural organic practices that we can use instead of those. You can be using compost. You can leave your leaves. It's like a natural mulch, a natural fertilizer for the lawn. We talked about mowing less or having an area of grass that's taller There are lots of weeds that are actually very helpful to bees, and early in the spring, there are things that actually help the bugs and critters. So letting your grass grow can be another thing that saves you time and soaks up more water. And then again, talking to your friends and neighbors about these practices and helping them learn as well. And lastly, pets. Every time it rains, you do not want to swim in the creek, because every time it rains, the bacteria count in the creek spikes up like this. So, dog waste on the trails that can wash right into the creek is something we want to prevent. Always pick up after your pet. Obviously, there's also bacteria from like the wild animals that are in the creek, but we can't pick that up. But there have been cases actually in the last couple of years of, pets drinking from the creek, maybe right after it rains, and there are high bacterial counts and they can get sick. So just as a general rule, never want to like swim or submerge your head in the creek after it has just rained. And you always want to pick up after your pet. Any questions on things to do at home or general practices? I will say that we have a lot of resources on our website under a tab that is called like Take Action at Home. And you can find a list of practices and links and resources on, how you can dig into more. But if anyone has any specific questions, I'm happy to answer those now. I don't see any for now. Going once, going twice. Okay, sold. So I want to plug something we're doing coming up called Ask an Expert. We are soliciting for questions that our staff members will answer about wildlife, land management, water, events, all different things. So keep an eye on your emails and keep an eye on our social media. Over the next few weeks, we'll be asking kind of open poll for questions that you can submit, and then we as staff will be answering all public questions. So if anything occurs to you later, please stay tuned for those. And if you want to get in touch with me, or if you want more information about how you can get involved in water quality monitoring and volunteering, or if you have specific questions maybe about the tributary near where you live, or want to have more info about data that we have collected over the years, my email is lindsay@wissahickontrails.org. Please feel free to get in touch with me and we can chat further. And if anyone doesn't have any questions, I will say thank you so much for tuning in. It was great to have all of you. Virtual programs, while it's really nice to be in person with everyone, at least still get to see everyone's faces. It's a good time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and do reach out if you have any follow-up questions.
Awesome job there, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
My pleasure. And again, this recording will be available later.
Thanks, Lindsay.
My pleasure.